Before I begin, I just want to kind of say that I've really enjoyed today. I think it's been very enlightening, and the talk's been very interesting, and now we want to get a chance to just have kind of a discussion around it with the broader group. So I'm just going to have one question to kind of kick us off, but my goal is actually to have this more for the audience to ask questions to the panel and stimulate some discussion between them. So one of the ways Ken, Benoit, and I kind of thought about this day was to think of like, the problem of like unethical conduct in business can be kind of thought of as three levels. So like one, are people not virtuous? Like, so is it about kind of a CEO as an individual who's like dressing in their bedroom as a person? Is it what Adam talked about, the architecture, right? How like a company or organizational is set up? Or is it kind of the rules and laws of society, right? The rules of the game. So one question I can open up to anybody is something said today you found really compelling, and why did you find it compelling? Or is something somebody said today you're not quite sure of, or you disagree with, or you kind of just doesn't seem right to you, and why? So either kind of an opportunity for agreement or disagreement. I just want to kick that off.
I come from a culture in which it's much more fun to talk about the things you learn from people than the things you disagree with them about. So maybe somebody who comes from this more adversarial culture.
Well, we start with the learning. What is something I think you learned today that maybe you didn't know before?
Well, I don't know a lot about the research on, say, leadership, and so almost everything I was told about the research on leadership was new to me and helpful.
One thing that I found interesting, right, was sort of your talk was basically that we should think about like people's reactions, right? This sort of psychological thing. And then your talk was like, we should go beyond the psychological reaction. So it's like, you're like, we teach ethics, but people have these reactions. You're like, people have these reactions, but we need to teach ethics. So it's kind of in some ways you guys were saying opposite things. So that's the one thing that I was at one level.
Rebecca, do you want to react to that?
Sure, and I was talking about it. I believe that if you are truly rooted in yourself and wishing for the well-being of the community and yourself, that you are much more likely to behave ethically. And that while the ethical problem of what should I do in this tough situation is important and interesting, the central problem facing our society right now is not, is it ethical to do this? But even when you know the ethics, you are not doing it. So I think I'm just focused on a different problem. Not saying that ethical analysis is not important, but just saying for me right now, trying to understand the motivation is the important thing. But that, can I ask Adam a question?
Sure, of course, yeah.
I found myself listening. I mean, the talk was incredibly compelling, starting with your first examples, your first paired examples. And I'm curious whether you feel you're making an ethical example, an ethical argument, when you suggest we should act like the amazing pilot on the plane coming down, or you're making an instrumental argument that she will achieve her ends more effectively if she approaches people in this way. Similarly, with your example of sending everyone a little birthday note, is that an ethical thing to do that flows from someone's deep on wanting to treat people like human beings with dignity and respect? Or is it like, hey guys, you'll just get much better reactions? Or is it both? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. A couple of thoughts come to mind. The first is that, thinking there's a psychologist named Kirk Gray, and he got his PhD at Harvard, and his big theory is that all of sort of moral reasoning comes down to a central question of, does this cause harm or not, right? And so all of more, and so he kind of goes after John Haidt's sort of 5 sort of types of morality and says that it's really just about different interpretations of what causes more versus less harm. But if we go back to Tammy Jo Schultz, I think it's a great example of this because she landed this plane this crippled plane with just an incredible level of skill. And there's lots of other parts of it about how things that she did that really were, that required a level of skill. She was one of the, it turns out, the first pilots, female pilots to fly fighter jets. So she had this incredible level of experience. And she could have landed that plane and saved the lives of every single person without coming on the intercom and saying, we're not going down, we're going to Philly. And she could have gotten off that plane without going row by row and talking to those people. But by thinking of the psychological well-being of the people involved, she really elevated herself from a type of pure professional, right, to a type of, I would say, moral leader. I've asked people all over the world, like, what is this feeling of inspiration, right? And so there's this feeling, this sense of something that is, I call it sometimes a wellspring of hope and possibility, but there's a deepness, a wellness to it, right? That I think is really important about that. And I think it's that understanding of our impact on others. And so in some ways, if we just go back to Kurt Grace, she reduced harm, right, in those moments, even the reduced, emotional or psychological harm. And that was really, and I mean, even she was perplexed. She's like, I find it odd that people want to talk more about this stroll down the aisle than what it took to land this crippled plane, and so that, and I think this final thing I'll say about it is that it seems rare. Right. And so if it was what everyone did, it wouldn't be exceptional. But people seem stunned by this sort of, expressions of care and concern and thinking about the impact of our behavior on others.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the room. I'll interject occasionally too. But I'm going to cold call on Professor Kreps for our first question.
So I think that the really important question is, did we coordinate the red accents?
Yeah.
Just so you know that this cold calling me was planned in advance. This was, So getting back to the question of how do we teach MBAs to be more ethical? I understand Professor Appiah, did I say that right? Professor Appiah teach them through example and through analysis what is moral. Give them lots of practice. Just create more of a social sense, more connectedness with other people. There's a third thing that goes on, and this is the MBA Oath. And Rebecca will know all about the MBA Oath. MBA Oath is something invented at the Harvard Business School, where the students, and now a much broader audience, takes an oath like a Hippocratic oath. Is something like that effective? And to make it very pointed, some of the students will take the oath, some will not. If we could go 20 years later, will there be any difference in how ethical they behaved, those who did versus those who didn't?
My own view about psychology is that it's an experimental science. So, not having done the experiment, I don't know. I mean, in general, these kinds of codes are a little bit useful if they're properly framed in the life of students while they're students. So the honor code at the West Point, say, there's some role in regulating the life of, but I have nothing against West Point. I give them talks there. I respect the faculty there and so on. But I don't think they think that everybody who takes the oath there, the honor code oath there, is going to respond in an honorable way down the line. But some of them will. And the guy who basically brought Abu Ghraib to light, for example, was a West Point alum, and he listened in the ethics classes at West Point, and when he found something going on that he thought violated what he'd been told, he felt, as he said, honor bound to do something about it. And he was so honor bound about it that when he did the right thing, which was to report this to his direct superiors and they did nothing, he just went up the chain of command. And he ended up finally having to go to John McCain, to whom he had a right as an American citizen to speak. Right to petition the government is in the Bill of Rights. And that was really what got things going. So I don't know what role the honor code played in that, but honor certainly played an important role in that. And so the fact that they talk about honor there, in that case, turned out, I think, to be a good thing. In general, the classic American honor codes have a psychologically bizarre feature, which is that they tend to require you to report breaches of the honor code by other people. And that's a violation of one of the deepest honor codes, which is loyalty to your peers. So you're putting two dimensions of honor in conflict with one another. And that's one of the reasons why those don't work very well. I would say, I would take that out, frankly. But I did once get to talk to the honor boards of all the military academies, because they meet once a year. And the most shocking thing, apparently, that I told them was that, of course, honor can make you do the worst things as well as the good things. And not snitching on your peers can be a terrible thing, because that's omerta. That's what keeps the mafia running.
And what do you think about the Harvard Honor Code?
Well, a couple different things. One I'll say is that I think the Hippocratic Oath, which is a very unique one, I think is actually a very powerful one, because I think it's a guiding principle that solves a dilemma that doctors face on a daily basis, right? So do I do this or that? And if you have this simple principle like do no harm, right? It's a really helpful guide, which is kind of different from, complex ethical decisions that you face. You brought up the idea of social connections and personal relationships, and you sort of brought that up too. And, one thing that just occurred to me as you were talking was, there's a great profile about Peter Singer written in the New Yorker, and, and talks about all of his beliefs about how to spend resources, and one of the big points is that we shouldn't spend, inordinate resources on, let's say, the elderly who are failing. And of course, but in the end, he does that for his own mother,
Yes.
And so it's, the idea of the principles versus the personal relationships, I think becomes a very difficult thing. And loyalty, is one, when I teach ethics, the core thing that I teach is the idea of how we navigate tensions, right? So there's loyalty versus truth, right? There's justice versus mercy, right? And there's the individual versus the community. And I think the way that we actually become better leaders is by recognizing the tension and then trying to navigate it versus ignoring it and just going from one side to the other.
So, Rick, as a Harvard Business School professor, who's probably most intimately acquainted with the oath of any of us, I just want to have your thoughts. And it's kind of like, so just like also build on the question, I'm not sure what the current incarnation, but when I read the oath last time, it says, be a utilitarian, a Kantian, and a Rawlsian all at the same time, which is impossible. Okay, Dave.
You actually have it.
Yes, he printed it out.
Yeah.
You talk about it while we learn it.
Yeah,
Sure. So I want to use the principle that Adam introduced into the conversation, which is that of the architecture. So I think the effect of the oath is critically dependent on the context in which it's embedded and the intention with which it's taken. So rituals can be very powerful if they're taken with a group, if there's been a lot of discussion about why this ritual is important, if the ritual is costly in some way. So if you feel that nobody else is taking the oath because they think it's kind of a wimpy thing to do, but you are demonstrating that you're somehow different as you take it, and if you've had discussions about what it means beforehand. So to your experimental question, I would want to at least try and keep track of some of those conditions. In my own experience, watching the students take it, at least when I was part of that, it was a small group, and they invited their parents and their friends into the room to see them do it. And in those circumstances, I would expect it to have some effect. How much, I do not know. That would depend on a number of other, had they really thought about this? What was their backgrounds? But I wouldn't think it would be an empty gesture in the classic sense of, oh yeah, I just take the oath. So yeah, part of the social technology we can use to try and get people to pay attention to what they think is important and what they want to do with their lives.
So I'll just say one comment, which is going back to your point about I think this is a ridiculously bad oath because it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points. It's so complex. Like what makes the Hippocratic oath work is it's so simple, right? Do no harm. The oath, I will tell the truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. Like what you need is a single.
So the Google oath is don't be evil. I guess they changed it to do the right, but that could be viewed as the opposite thing where it's like too simple and meaningless. So where do you draw the line?
I mean, I think it's got to be embedded in the courtroom, truth matters, right? In the hospital, harm matters. And so I think what you need to do is you need to decide, like in the world of business, what's the 1 or 2 things that really matter and specify then, because you can't remember all 7 of these or 8 of these things, and therefore they don't basically have no real value.
But may I say this is a classic instance of whether you're focusing on the left side or the right side of my diagram. Because I would say it doesn't matter a nut what's actually in the oath. The students are not going to remember. They're not going to go back and look it up. Hopefully what they remember is that sense of committing in front of their friends and their families to when they came to difficult moments trying to do the right thing. Now, I'm exaggerating. It's not that I'm in favor of really badly written oaths.
Yes.
I'm just saying that one can over-focus on the kind of details of the words when what's really important is, like, are you going to do the right thing? And does this oath help you remember to do that?
I mean, one thing I think there's good evidence that there's the level of cheating at institutions that have honor codes against cheating and ones that don't have an honor code is about the same. I don't think that makes any difference. But that's because in the institutions that have it, unlike this one, everybody's required to sign up to it. So there's no investment, is it, right? Yeah. It has no individual meaning. Right. The neat feature of this one is that it's not imposed on you by the institution. It's a decision among members of a graduated class to do something together, presumably intending to commit themselves together to behaving in ways that they're not sure that everybody in the class will behave. And that might be a useful thing. Even I think the content of it is not super helpful. But
I haven't seen the latest incarnation, so do show me. And Professor Kreps, I will go back to them and say, what?
I want to add one quick thought, which is, you and I said something really similar, and I think gets back to the heart of what you're saying, whichever the left or the right side was on. But the idea of the power of examples, right? And I think that one thing that, and I guess there's 2 other things when I think about being an architect and a designer, like there's the opening the channels, and then there's the, let's say, the act of making a commitment, right? And what matters more, the channel or the commitment? I go back to this famous study done in the 1960s about getting Yale students to get a tetanus shot, and they had 2 different pamphlets. One was the fear approach, which showed like diseased body parts, and it scared the shit out of people, but it didn't lead them to get the vaccine. And the other one had both a map, but also said, commit to a time in your schedule when you can get the vaccine. And so that's a double barrel problem. We don't know is the map or the commitment that made the difference. And so one question is, what's the value of the commitment versus the value of the channel? And I think that you're sort of saying the commitment itself is enough. And I'm questioning whether the commitment without an example that they can sort of, attach to, or a simple principle that they can use the commitment for, may have less purchase. But it's an interesting question. I mean, it's a great question to do that longitudinal analysis, right? Like, let's find out who took it and who didn't and see what the outcomes are.
Well, but you'd have terrible sample selection bias.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to open it up for the group. I guess Maria has a first question.
Hi, I'm Maria France. I'm the director of the Business Government Society Initiative with Ken Schatz. One of our focus areas is on technology and the societal impact of tech. And I was grateful that Professor Appiah brought up ChatGPT. I'd love to know your thoughts on how do we teach the ethical use and implementation of AI. In particular, sitting in Silicon Valley, it's a massive gold rush with, I think, high stakes for the winners and high stakes for the losers. So I'm just curious how you weigh that and how we might actually instill some of that thinking into our students.
Well, I'll just say one thing. My cousin was here today. She's a master's student in engineering, so got to see. And she told me a story that she graduated college from Notre Dame, whatever, the same spring that ChatGPT came out, and all of her friends lost their job offers, like that, And so I think one of the things that, and if you look at psychologists who study sedative well-being, Ed Diener and Laura King and Sonia Libersky and those people. And, when they first did this huge analysis of like the predictors of well-being, they're like, it's going to be relationships, like that's, and they were surprised by how much workplace identity mattered, like to the jobs that people had and feeling a sense of connection. And so I think one of the things that we have to think about is, how do we're all here. We all, we have jobs. We like our jobs, so how do we make sure that we're like, what happens if consultants no longer lead consultants, right? And what happens to MBA programs? Like what happens to our jobs, and so I think part of it is starting to think about is how do we use these technologies without decimating entire industries, essentially, and how do we use that efficiency to make lives better rather than to create a whole new group of people who have, like the manufacturing sector, right? What happens when the manufacturing sector left? And that's a moral question, I think, Owen Level.
It's, these questions about the impact on employment of AI are obviously very important questions. But there's a sort of meta question, which is, whose job is it to think about them? And I think of this problem as a paradigm of something that requires political solutions, and that the private sector, it can create a few jobs, but it isn't its job to structure the world in such a way that there's meaningful employment for everybody. And I think it's absolutely right that for most modern people, wasn't true in the past, but for most modern people, a significant part, especially people in people with university educations, a significant part of the reward of their labor is not the emoluments, it's the sense that they're doing something significant. And people don't like doing what in the technical language of anthropology is called shit jobs. They may do them if they're paid enough, but they'd rather be doing something that they think of as significant, and I think significant for society, not just for the other people they work with. So that's important too. Relational significance, I think, is important for most of us in our work. Now, we should remember that it's great to worry about these things now because they're facing people like us, but we haven't done a terribly good job of caring about those things for people who have left the educational system when they finished high school. And that's another challenge our society faces. And again, it's not a challenge that is up to business to solve. That is a problem that's up to society through politics and philanthropy to work on. Though I would say one thing about the kind of job that the president imagines creating more of, many of those jobs didn't require more than a high school education, and did give people a sense of significance because the communities around big factories and being a member of a union and going to union picnics together and all that, it was a relational meaning. You felt you were making something that people all around the world were buying if you made a car in Detroit. So I think, and that in a way, it seems to me, is one of the most important questions for us now is, are we creating an economy in which the ideal is we would to create an economy in which everybody, whatever they're doing, can think of themselves as making a significant contribution and not just making a living, that they should be making a decent living too, but that's a different question.
I mean, can I just say one quick thing about that is that, when I teach ethics, I always talk about creative destruction, right? And this idea of creative destruction, right, is that, that there's new technologies basically destroy the old jobs, right? So the phone destroyed the telegraph, and then this destroyed the people who did those things. And so there's constantly jobs being lost along the way. And then you go back to Rawls and the Maximin thing. So how do we protect the losers, right? Who just by chance the new technology took away them? And I think that's a political question, but it's also a societal level question. Sorry.
Of course, the opposing state, business, society is a little bit, is what I did, is not quite right, because obviously one thing that society can do is create industrial policies, which create incentives for private businesses to create worthwhile jobs, for example. Becca, go ahead.
So Duron Acemoglu and Paul Simon Johnson have a really interesting book about the general pattern, this creative destruction, and how very important it is to have the state and civil society engaged in modifying the effects of these technologies. And one of the distressing things about the potential of harm that AI could cause is not merely on employment. It could cause the enormous concentration of power. So the people who control the technology have access to all kinds of information that others do not have. With the concentration of power could come the concentration of wealth and control. We could be looking at a true surveillance state. I worry about the effect on education. If all the things you learn in the early years of education or the early years of being a labor lawyer or a consultant can be reproduced by AI, how is anyone going to learn those early things? Because you just turn to a machine and do it. I worry about its effects on everyday interaction. If AI becomes increasingly what we relate to, and AI, you could see it going so many different ways, right? I remember being at a conference where people were confidently asserting that no one would want to hang out with an AI companion because it would be clear they were a machine. And one of the psychologists in the room roared with laughter and said, no, they'll tell you exactly what you want to hear. They'll never offend you. They know exactly how to manipulate you. So will our lives be full of entities that know exactly how to manipulate us, and to what end will they do that? So the question about the effects it will have on the texture of our society, I don't mean to downplay the effects on employment, which are clearly huge, but there are effects and effects and effects. And at the moment, we are having almost no organized conversation about that. Deliberative democracy has all kinds of issues, but one could imagine running like carefully curated conversations across the country with experts talking about how do we want to talk about this technology if we had an administration that was interested in exerting power over it, which currently we do not.
When the internet first came out, it was seen as this incredible opportunity to connect people who were especially isolated, right? And there was a study done by a psychologist at Carnegie Mellon. It was a multi-year study, and their hypothesis was that the internet was going to lower the loneliness that people experienced. And there's so much evidence that loneliness is one of the most corrosive things that can happen. But they found out that internet use was correlated with more loneliness, right? And so we're already starting to see that with AI, right? With the people who most need social interaction are relying on this, and it's creating an immediate sense of connection, but then a larger sense of disconnection. And so I think that's a really, really fascinating issue.
I want to connect a few things from some of your comments and then throw at you, all of you, a couple of ideas or comments for your commenting on that. So, Rebecca said that, you or one of you said that you don't want to just say, or maybe it was Ken who said, you don't want to tell them what to do, give them ethics, lectures. sort of teach them specific things. But I wonder about specific words that are less controversial. You know, these days they seem controversial. Empathy, justice, fairness, you know, words like that. Can you kind of, you know, get them to say, yeah, that's a good thing. And what does it mean then to you? So that my comments are based on just trying to make things more specific. My other point is about personal experiences and more of an immersion, because Professor Appiah was talking about his childhood and the experience of seeing the slaves, etc., whereas Adam was bringing up, you know, a Southwest. So that plane, I looked it up, that was a Boeing plane. That was in 2018, so that's before the crashes that awoken us all to the safety problems in Boeing. And so the question is, okay, the pilot of that particular flight was very, you know, wonderful and ethical and all of that. But the people at Boeing, what about them and why they allowed their planes to be so unsafe? Why the CEO said the plane was safe even after one crash, and it needed another crash to kind of awaken other people and then for them to admit some of the stuff. So my point on that, which leads to my question, is, what if business leaders, you know, instead of an oath, had a commitment or a requirement by law to shadow poor people for a day, 2 days, 1 weekday, 1 weekend, that they would see how people across the rail live? Because I feel like sometimes the business leaders that we're talking to, depending on where they came from, obviously some of them came from various origins that they kind of have personal experience. Are they too detached from the impact of what they do? And would forcing a personal experience or an encounter with a human living differently than them help in teaching ethics?
Okay, who wants to take that first?
So why don't I take first effort? So first, you mentioned maybe we should mention some of these words. I continue to believe that eliciting from the students, you know, what do you think a skillful life is a better way of doing it, but they should definitely be in the room. To your question about CEO distance and what happened at Boeing, I actually have done a fair amount of work at Boeing and was first there about 30 years ago. And the company was classically purpose-driven. It was full of a commitment to the planes, to the quality of the engineering. They had layer on layer on layer of safety reviews. One way of understanding what happened, and I think it happened at many other companies, to your point, is they moved the headquarters to Chicago. They started managing it entirely on the numbers and not on the quality of engineering. And so it went from being a deeply embedded company in which everyone is together creating something to just get it out as fast as possible. So in that sense, it's emblematic of what happened. Whether it could be reversed by giving people like weekends with poor people. Actually, I have friends who do that. They take senior leaders to places with inequality or disease or climate change. It opens a conversation, but you then have to follow up with concrete architectures, examples, commitments. So it could be part of an intervention, but it's not alone a silver bullet. One thing that might be very effective, but is really hard, is getting people to live in the communities where their factories and products are having effects. One of the other problems is everything is so disaggregated. And then the other is the sheer inequality. I mean, if I'm living in my private jet surrounded by, so the distance is wider and wider and wider. So yes, all of the above.
I mean, I do think, it's a classic. I mean, there's a whole TV show of like the boss taking the low level thing and knowing, and there's a great Saturday Night Live Kylo Ren skit around that. And Trading Places, one of my favorite movies back in the 80s.
It's a great movie.
Is sort of that idea. But, actually Southwest Airlines, I don't know if they still do this. I used to teach a case 20 years ago, but every employee had to do like the other roles. Like, so you didn't have to be the pilot, but pilots had to do baggage handling for a day, reservations for a day, and flight attendants for a day. So you got the experience. And so you created empathy for people. And I think that's a really important point. And just as a side point, people always talk about, oh, it's so great to have a devil's advocate, right, in a room. It's great decision making. And I was working with one company, and they decided to have this sort of devil's advocate person, and they picked the person that everyone respected, the most neutral person. And after 6 months, they all hated this person, and they became a scapegoat. And so we put in a rotational system. So every meeting, someone else was the devil's advocate. And I think there's two things that happened. One is no one became a scapegoat, but everyone had the experience of being in that role. And so it's really kind of a, perspective taking through role taking. And I do think there's something really, really powerful in doing that.
I mean, as far as sort of the contribution of philosophers to all this is concerned, I mean, I think the main thing we can do for our societies is take the concepts that people are using to live their lives and develop a deeper understanding of them. And so in my case, it's not so much, I don't care so much whether I tell them or they tell me what the relevant concepts are, but and I'm not urging them to take any particular view on the questions that are controversial. I'm not trying to get them to agree with me. I'm trying to persuade them that the concepts that I'm teaching them are useful for living a life, or running a business, or being a parent, or the many things that ethics is relevant to. So that's and I do think that, as I said, that one of the things I've learned from doing this column is that people very often don't notice that there's an important thing they ought to be thinking about. So they tell you a bunch of stuff, but then I often have to say, here's what you haven't told me. This is what I think it's obvious you would need to know in order to proceed. So providing people with a set of tools for making sure they've thought about the right things, that list is too long, but it mentions a list of things that a decent person will sometimes have to think about, and I think that's useful. But unlike Socrates, who thought that if you taught people what was right, they would, as it were, automatically do it, I believe that that's not so. And the question of how people who don't know what's right obviously can't do what's right. So it's helpful to give people the right concepts. But figuring out how you get the motivational thing, which is, I think, really what you was central to your talk, that seems to me, and that does, I think, have a lot to do with the question that I said about what kind of person do I want to be. And I think that's, one of the central ethical questions, and making sure to people to realize that basically they won't be happy if they don't have answers to those questions. Happy in the big sense of living a meaningful life, so that you can look back at the end of it and say, you can expect St. Peter to let you in, as it were.
It's funny that, your list, that was like the second question, I think. So it's
Yes.
like, what's that? What, the person I want to be?
Yes.
And I would have made it first, right? Because I was surprised that the order, about that.
Well, they came in order of the birth of the philosopher associate.
Sorry. But I do want to say one thing about that's come up a little bit about this idea of business versus society or government. And I think that one of the things I think you said this last night versus today. I'm a little confused about but about the privatization of water in England, and eventually sewage is now in the water, and one of the problems is that there's certain things, right, where the profit motive shouldn't be present, right, or be reduced, and which is why we have government control over certain things, and we can see some of the things happening in hospitals, right, where the focus is on profitability rather than on health, right. Boeing is a great example of that. And so I do think we need to rethink the role of business and what things business should be in control of, but certain things are different. I was talking to Benoit yesterday and about the idea that you can do some things more efficiently, but it's not better, right? And some things we want to do better. And so we sacrifice efficiency because we value this thing that's better. And I think that's another great way to think about it.
Can I jump in?
Sure, yeah, of course.
which is sometimes people interpret what I say as if only business people were moral, life would be good. But firstly, it's most unlikely that all business people will like, hey, I should do the right thing. And that in the end, it's the architecture, it's the incentives, it's the institutions. We need major political change. But then you come back to, well, and how in hell are we going to get that, right? So this is a kind of complex interacting system. And I think the model in my head is something like, it would be really helpful if a few business people at least demonstrated that acting ethically was consistent with running a successful firm, that would be useful. It would be useful if a few business people thought that supporting democracy was really a good thing. Not only because it would, I think, change the conversation or can help support a different conversation, but also as things get worse, which I'm afraid I think they will, very helpful to have openings where people can say, no, we could do it this way, and that would be okay. And you would be happier if we did it that way. Something like that.
I completely agree with that, but except that I think there are such people.
Oh, of course there are.
Yes, sorry.
No, my book is full of them.
Yes.
Absolutely. No, the goal is to show up examples in the
Yes.
same way that Adam is showing examples. Is like, no, look at this, and it works, and here how it works, and just to open the imaginative space for the idea that behaving ethically could be very skillful.
One of my favorite, so I'm a member of a group called Society for Progress, which is run out of NCAD, and we give prizes to business people who do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite examples, well, two great examples. One is the guy who runs Maersk, which is a lot.
Oh, yes, and the shipping guy, he's super interesting. And might have shifted the whole industry.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I've talked to him about this, and he said, I decided we had to be carbon neutral by 2030, and the engineers said that's not possible. He said, well, you're engineers. If I say we have to do this, you have to go away and figure out how to make it possible, and they have. So, and that was an ethical. I mean, he wasn't thinking about profits when he had that
he
thought.
was ethically driven, and that's a lovely example of why being ethically driven can make a difference. Because that decision was fraught with risk.
Yes.
Right? But because he thought it was the right thing and critical on so many fronts, he pushed it through.
And his board went along with him.
And of course, and that was very helpful. But so we sometimes think there's tension between instrumentality and being ethical. But no, the two can be enormous complements. Yeah.
One of my other favorite examples is a company in Costa Rica, which is the largest alcohol producer.
I just want to make sure we have time for one more question. Okay, so I think we have about 6 minutes left, so hopefully this can stimulate some final comments from people. Yeah.
So my name is Stephen Band. I'm an alum of the business school here.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
And a former diplomat and also former entrepreneur. And I want to channel Jeff Pfeffer, who's a colleague of many people in the room here, a little bit, if I may, who's written and taught about power for 40 years. And I think, and others can correct me if I'm wrong, it would be true to say that Jeff would argue that the getting, keeping, use, etc. of power and ethical behavior are really two different universes. And I know for certain that he would argue, for example, that apologizing for something is almost always a certain way to lose power, or to use a more neutral word, to lose authority. So I guess in a way I'm challenging a little bit what has just been said, but if Jeff is roughly right, you're never really going to solve problems by trying to teach people to be ethical, because you're likely to be causing them to lose power as they move forward in their careers and assume leadership positions and so on. And I think, final thought, this means that we really do need governance and, to use another word that I don't think's been used as often, regulation to do these things, because it's not going to come from...
So just to kind of rephrase that, the business education, many students come to me and says, how can we have a class called Paths to Power and a class called Leading with Values in the same business school? I'm very confused by what you're trying to tell us. So just kind of curious, this potential tension between business schools teaching power and kind of Machiavellian strategies for success alongside ethical leadership. So reactions to that.
I'm just going to say one thing, that I 100% disagree with Jeff saying that apologizing is always a way to lose power. I 100% believe that there are times when apologizing will actually increase your power, and we could talk about that later. But one of the things that you bring up, right, is this idea that there's tensions that we face, right? And that's what I tried to bring up before, and we have to try to navigate those, and I think those are really difficult. I'm going to just say one thing that kind of veers a little bit from what you said, but it comes back a little bit what you said about ChatGPT and what happens when we don't teach people the early things that they need to learn. And I think one of the most difficult things to think about as a parent is what things do you protect your kids from versus, or try to teach them about versus let them experience, right? And I think that's one of the most difficult things. And I was talking to a friend of mine recently who's divorced, and this person's wife has some, or ex-wife has some characterological flaws, and the question is, how much do they protect their kids from those flaws, or let them experience them themselves and go through that? And it's one of the most the difficult decisions that you can ever face. But at one level, the only way for them to learn is to experience it. And so I think it raises a question of, like, what things do we let people experience versus teach them? And I think those are very complicated questions.
Other thoughts?
Some of the most powerful people I met have been deeply ethical. There are many ways to exercise power. Paul Pullman, who ran Unilever, a very interesting and complicated man, but he could go from talking about the need to serve starving children to, excuse me, the sale figures in Indonesia are completely off. What do you think you're doing? I mean, he could really moderate that in a very effective way, and I've seen that a lot. Secondly, I think you're describing one of the deepest problems facing the human race. A few people will go after power, and sort of the job of the rest of society is to develop control mechanisms. And there's a whole variety of control mechanisms, of which one is talking about ethic and what is a skillful life. Another is democracy. Another is shaming. There were societies that deliberately shamed people who brought together too much wealth and power as being like, what's wrong with you, and would really work on it. So that tension, I think, is core to the human experience. And of course, you should be teaching both at the business school because they're both real.
Anthony, any last thoughts before we adjourn and bring Ken up?
Not a big expert on seeking power, and so I will defer to people in your world for whom it's important. But I think it is important to stress the polyvalence of our situations. The one reason ethical life is interesting is because there are many different things going on. Many things matter. Figuring out which is the most important one in a particular situation can be hard. And if you need power to do good in a business, then you need to accumulate power to do good. But you shouldn't, ethically speaking, be after it for its own sake. You should be after it for its instrumental value in serving other purposes. Power is not an end in itself, and so on. And I think these are all things. Again, if you asked me to teach a course on power, I would, and I would I would do some history and some movies and so on. And I wouldn't be particularly after getting them to agree with me about power, but I would be trying to get them to see that these issues are kind of complicated and that they interact with many other things. And so they have choices to make. I don't think I can force them to make the right choices, but they'll certainly not make the right choices if they haven't had a time to think about these kinds of complexities and the ways in which power and other issues come together.
Awesome. We'll give a hand to our panel. This is terrific discussion.